Hi everyone. Today I'm joined with Michael, who is straight from Ann Arbor. Michael is the Associate Director of Admissions at University of Michigan Ross School of Business. How are you doing today, Michael?
I am well. Thanks for having me, Suvik. This is great. I'm happy to be online with everybody.
Awesome. So this podcast is basically to give prospective applicants an overview of what is it like applying to Ross, what happens to their application after they hit submit, and generally, just to get to know a little bit more about the school, right? So,
Yeah,
but first
great.
off, Michael, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Tell us what you do at Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a little bit of a long story. I'll shorten it a bit, but it's kind of related. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, actually. So I came to Ann Arbor from a big city, and I came to Ann Arbor for my undergraduate degree, and I absolutely fell in love with Ann Arbor. I could easily talk for the next hour about why I love it so much, but that's not why you all tuned in. But long story short, after my undergraduate degree, I was back in New York living with my wife, and she started looking at MBA programs across the United States and fell in love with Ross. So we actually moved back to Ann Arbor later in our lives, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I was initially working, I have a nonprofit background, but I was working with our alumni association here at Michigan. So really got to see the power of our alumni network come to life. And then after my wife graduated in 2015, I got to join the admissions team. So for the past 2 years, been on the admissions committee, specifically recruiting India along with the Middle East region, and I've really enjoyed I've been to India now, I believe, 4 times in the past year and a half. So really love what I do, but I feel really strongly about this community. I always say one of my biggest regrets was not applying to Ross when my wife did, because I was blown away by how much I enjoyed meeting her classmates, and they're now lifelong friends of ours. So I'm happy to be recruiting future classes to this amazing place.
Right. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Michael. Really
Yeah,
good to know. So I wanted to ask you a few questions that we get a lot of requests for. The first one being, so I go to the University of Michigan Wolverine portal. I,
yeah.
I put in all my details. I write my essays and everything. I get my recommendations, and then I hit submit. Right. So that's where the speculation starts. Right. So can you
Yeah.
give us an overview of what happens after an applicant hits submit?
Of course. It's funny you say Wolverine Portal. You've done your homework. I appreciate that. I feel really strongly. One thing I've said, maybe watching my wife go through this, that this really is a black box of sorts. And I feel like that's incredibly unfair given how much time everybody spends on this. And that's important to us. So I really pride myself and this team on being as transparent and as accessible as possible. So I encourage, we'll talk about a lot today, but generally speaking, ask questions and feel free to reach out to us. That's what we're here for. But in terms of what happens after you hit submit, the first thing we'll do sounds a bit silly, but we really look to see that applications are fully complete. And that sounds easier said than done, but particularly in terms of maybe recommendation letters that haven't come in, we won't review an application until it is complete. So making sure that all the pieces are there. And then once it is, we'll have at least one reader, if not two readers, take a look at the application, read the essays, go through transcripts, see somebody's resume, and make initial recommendations for who we interview. That takes some
Mhm.
time, which is why we have two waves often in our rounds. And there's really never a difference in if I got invited in wave one or wave two. Ooh, my chances are better. It just takes us time to go through all the applications. And that's really the
Right.
stage where, we're trying to get a sense of, do we want to learn more about this person? That's the question we're asking. There is no minimum test score or years of work experience at that stage. There really never is, but really at that stage, it's, have you convinced us we want to talk to you for 45 minutes of, in an interview about if you're a good fit for our program? That's really what you're trying to convince us of. And then hopefully we're able to interview you, and then an interview report comes back, and we'll all take a close look at that interview report and the application as a whole, and have a really thorough discussion about the applicant. If you're not invited to interview, sometimes we waitlist you because you're somebody we're really interested in, but depending on the rest of the pool or how many applicants with a similar background decide to accept our offer in that round, and we'll maybe invite you in a later round, or you may be trending towards a deny pile. But there's a mix of outcomes if you're not interviewed. Does that kind of help?
Yeah. I think the two waves that you mentioned definitely get a lot of speculations going. But
Of course.
I remember last time when I was closely watching the Ross application cycle, everybody's like, "Oh, if I did not get in the wave one, that means I'm automatically not as good as the candidates in wave two," which I don't
Yeah.
think is true. Correct?
No, that's the ultimate message board rumor. It really is just a matter of us reading through applications. There, and we don't. It's not alphabetical. It's not based on where they came from. It's just we're going to look at every application, and that takes a lot of time in that period. It's a really busy time of year, so I hope people don't read too much into that at all.
So awesome. Thanks for clarifying that. Getting into the nitty gritty of the application itself. So last year, Ross had only one essay. This time, it has more than one. It has three of them.
Right.
Why did you decide to make that shift? Number one. Number two, when you evaluate candidates and when you're looking for leadership specifically, and I think for Ross, the whole concept of action-oriented leadership is the true calling of Ross. So how really evaluate what you're looking for in applicants actually?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the one thing I'd say overall is, we use the phrase holistic review often, and it's because it's the truth, and we do it in every sense of the phrase. I think applicants sometimes get sick of hearing it from schools or think we're lying, but I promise you, I've come up with a saying, there's no one thing that gets you into business school, and there's never one thing that keeps you out. And I really, truly believe that. We've denied applicants with a 790 GMAT, and we've accepted applicants with a really poor GPA, or who have very little work experience. We're really looking for many different facets, and I think the simplest way to talk about it is trying to break it into three buckets, right? The first is your academic profile, which is your history of your undergrad transcripts, or maybe even graduate transcripts, especially in India. And combine that with a test score. So looking at that and saying, are you prepared for the rigor of the classes and the core curriculum? The second thing is, looking at your work experience and saying, are you going to add to our classroom discussions and the makeup of the class? And secondly, is this a background that's going to be appreciated and do well in recruiting and set you up well for that outcome? And then the third is the ultimate buzzword from all business schools, is this idea of fit. We look at the interview and the essays and really try to get a sense for, is this person a typical Ross student? Is this person going to fit in our community? Are they somebody who's going to make a difference here? And I'll be honest, every applicant that we admit in the class checks all three boxes. You can't really just do two of the three and skip the other. So right. I know it's very cliche, a high-level answer, but we really do expect to see all three things done well in the application. To answer your specific question about the essays, I do think Sujin, our admissions director, and all of us as a team got together this spring, and we liked our old essay question. I really enjoyed reading some of the things that people were proud about, but we often felt like it wasn't enough, or that some people were proud of something they accomplished in the workplace, and that kind of muddled with the resume stories. We really wanted more opportunities to learn about you and how you've made a difference, or how you work with others, and stories about your life. So this idea of, instead of one 300-word essay that's maybe a medium essay, as you would say, having three shorter essays would give us more insight and snapshot into who you are as a person. And that's something we really cared about and wanted to learn more.
Awesome. And I also think the Ross essay questions this year are refreshing. And I think, given the options, that also gives applicants a chance to, okay, I want to write this more than I want to write that. So I think that also goes in their favor.
No, I'm glad. I appreciate the feedback. I felt the same way and argued for it. I hope the choices aren't overwhelming. There is no specific question we want to see more of or hope to see more of. We really just thought, hey, there are lots of stories candidates can tell, and we want to give you the option to tell us something that's really meaningful to you. So don't overthink it. Just tell us a great story.
Awesome. So I wanted to pivot a little bit to, like the ideal Ross student. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background of why we try to do these podcasts a little bit different from, let's say, an information session in a city. We want to do this a little bit more candid, so like students can also learn a little bit more about their schools apart from the information that they get in information events, right? So I wanted
Right.
to ask you, if you had to, stereotype or generalize a very typical raw student, what kind of traits do you think he or she will manifest on a daily basis?
Yeah, I love talking about this. I mean, I'll probably hit on three things that jump out to me. One is this idea of somebody who really likes to get their hands dirty, problem solve, be out in the field, and who learns and grows as a person by feeling it and by doing it. We talk about action-based learning or experiential learning or learning by doing. All of these phrases sort of mean the same thing, but they're all ways to describe who we are and what we're about. I'll be very candid and say I think all business schools talk about it right now as a buzzword or something that they believe in. We were the first school to do it, and I think we bring it out the most. But that appeals to a very specific type of candidate in person. There are really successful business school candidates or even leaders who work better alone or have a couple of close confidants but don't really love, want to be in the corner kind of, working on things themselves. We really look for somebody who's the opposite of that, who feeds off the energy of saying, I learn business best by doing it, and I want to problem solve and get a feel for it myself, and I'm going to jump right into that. You have to, I think, be very proactive and willing to immerse yourself in that and feel a part of that, and you have to think about how you learn best. So that's the first thing that would stand out. The second is this idea of learning best but from people who are different around you. That's something that really means a lot to me and was part of my Michigan education, and it's something I love about this place. We really pride ourselves on recruiting lots of non-traditional backgrounds and having an extremely diverse class in more than just number of countries or the age of people or male and female, but really in terms of backgrounds. Business backgrounds are actually third on our list after engineering and humanities. There's a reason for that. We're known as a place where there are lots of different perspectives, and we're going to ask you to collaborate with each other. Our dean's always saying that business is no longer a vertical sport. You can't overly specialize anymore, right? You have to work cross-functionally, and that leaders who really cross boundaries and work well across different parts of the organization thrive. So if you're the type of person that feeds off of that, wants to be a part of that, we feel like Ross is the place for you. And the last thing I'd say, and it's similar, but those who want to be leaders, we feel really strongly about our student community and our culture being really student-driven and a place where you can create things. If you see a problem or a need, or you can go create it. For example, we didn't have a traditional fintech club in the last couple of years. It's something that's growing. So we had a couple of students who went and started a fintech conference last year. I think we thrive off of people who really take the bull by the horns and want to create things and take leadership roles. We say every student here is a leader because they are. There's so many opportunities to do that, and I think it's different than some other programs where you're in a city and maybe distracted by other things. Here, everybody's really immersed in extracurricular activities and what happens outside the classroom, and we need people who are going to really take the energy to do that.
Thank you so much for sharing. That was actually really well detailed, and I hope future Ross applicants are listening, because this kind of stuff is hard to get just from very superficial research. So thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah, I know all the websites and brochures sound alike, so I'm hoping that this is a little bit better.
So on the flip side, and I know this is a hard question to answer on behalf of admissions. So what kind of student or what kind of an applicant would you be, a little bit wary before accepting?
Yeah, I mean, that is difficult to answer, and I hope some of what I say doesn't just sound like the opposite of before, but I do think it's relevant. I think applicants who worked solely on their own on projects or don't display a natural orientation for teamwork. And I don't mean this to say, if I'm an entrepreneur who has my own business, that I'm not a good fit for Ross. That's not what I'm saying. But I think there are candidates in the process who sort of come off as somebody who likes to be alone, work alone, who hasn't really worked cross-functionally very much or hasn't shown an interest in doing so. That's something that kind of worries us because we want you to be comfortable working on teams, being comfortable with people who have different backgrounds than you. So I think it's something to really make sure, especially if you're in a role that maybe asks you to work a lot alone, show us that you, whether it's outside the office or you've asked for projects that give you the opportunity to work more cross-functionally or in a leadership role, that would be helpful. And then, applicants who are a little too narrow maybe in their line of work. We believe a lot in, we have a general management curriculum. We believe strongly in that. It prepares you for our MAT projects, for internships, for a career pivot. I think it's great having a very, very clear sense of what you want to do, and that's important in this process. But there are some applicants who sometimes are overly narrow in their field and don't seem very interested or open to learning about other functions or industries. And I don't think that's a great fit with our program sometimes. And then the last thing I would say is, it's really quality over quantity during the application process. I'd rather hear about 2 or 3 projects or things you're passionate about that you've really made a meaningful impact on, as opposed to 20 different things you've accomplished in the past 3 years. Those things start to blend a little bit, and they don't feel very meaningful. And Ross students are passionate people who really immerse themselves in things. And I think it fits to show us that you've really made a difference in a couple areas. So don't feel, I think it's common for Indian applicants sometimes to think the competition's really, really a large pool and lots of very talented people. I need to stand out, so I'm going to have more than everybody else. It's really about having some more meaningful things than everybody else, if that makes sense.
You touched upon a really great nerve here, Indian applicants. So we're gonna take a little bit of time to talk about those. We are plenty of them. So,
Yeah.
so if you had to give, let's say, your #1 advice for Indian applicants, what would that be? And I'm just gonna go ahead out on my limb that like Ross also happens to be a target school for many Indian applicants, like much more than a few other top schools. I think the biggest reason is because I think it's University of Michigan. It's also has a great Indian network in itself. If you had to give okay, so if you are coming from, let's say you're an Indian guy or you're an Indian engineer or both, God forbid. So
we accept them.
So what would be your #1 advice for them?
Yeah, I hope this doesn't sound too cliche because I'm sure it's a common theme, but really be authentic and let us get to know who you are. I think Indian applicants feel this overwhelming pressure to make their work stories exceptional and stand out in a very academic sense of the world, and that is important. That's great, and it makes you stand out. But I never really get to know about what makes that person passionate. What difference have they made, in their community? What do they believe in and stand for? I can't stress enough. We remember stories and we care about them, and it's what makes our class tick. And recruiters want candidates who have interesting stories. And I wouldn't try to tell us what a consultant or what GMAT Club fellow posters may tell you think you have to say. If you start to stray too far from what you really care about and who you really are, you become sort of blending in. And I think it's really important to be yourself and really show us who you are throughout the process. And part of that, a second piece of advice maybe, is being really, really self-reflective. Sometimes hopefully it's not too hard a conversation with yourself, but knowing maybe the weaknesses of your application and being honest about them and taking responsibility for them, or if you had weaker undergrads, getting as best a test score as possible, or but really knowing your strengths and weaknesses and being able to tell that story, that comes through in the application much more than somebody who hasn't given much thought to what they want or who they are. And I guess the last thing really quickly is just control the controllables. I think people spend so much time thinking about, what everybody else on GMAT Club might be doing, or trying to figure out how we work, or if you spent that energy and time on the application, or maybe on some other things, that's really important. So really try to control what you can and don't obsess over what you
can. You mentioned test scores, and I'm pretty sure a lot of our viewers right now just turned their volume up a little bit. So, so I definitely want to ask you that question. And that's also something that, it's on the rumor mill, and I wanted to clarify. Would you say for an Indian applicant, the average GMAT is significantly higher than the average or the median GMAT of the entire class?
I do think, generally speaking, that's a fair assumption. I mean, this changes year to year, but you're generally viewed in the applicant pool in a set of your peers. Let's just be honest. And, it's how the diversity of the class works. And, we're reviewing applicants amongst their peers and backgrounds and regions. And it is somewhat natural to say that. So I think, knowing that shouldn't scare you away or be, cause lots of sensitivity or frustration. But I would hope, I'm a believer in transparency and knowing where you stand. So I think, it is definitely helpful to push yourself. If you're at the average of our class, though, you're a competitive applicant still. Even in the India pool, let's say, you're still a very competitive applicant. I think this advice is most helpful to say, I took it the first time and I'm, 10 points ahead of Ross's average. Oh, great. But maybe when on my practice exam, I could do 30 points better. And I know I have, and I haven't studied quite as hard as I can. I'd probably recommend taking it again. So because, that will help you in this process. And then secondly, it also helps you in the scholarship process as well. So, I think just knowing that in the back of your head is a good use of your time, and, being aware of it's hopefully helpful.
So would you say there is a magic number or there is the threshold of GMAT retakes crossing which makes the adcoms frown and roll their eyes?
Yeah, I'll answer in two ways. The first is that we, at least at Ross, I don't know how other schools look at it, but here at Ross, we never roll our eyes or look at like if you took an exam that you maybe saw in your head as a practice exam, but you reported it, we don't judge that too much. I mean, really at all. I think if anything, it shows us persistence, and we appreciate that effort. We know it's exhausting and it's a ton of time, and it's, almost can be overwhelming part of this process, right? It's maybe the most difficult. I don't, take anything away from anybody who's put in all that time to take it again. And, I've heard some other schools give the advice of like not showing us poor scores. We don't worry about that at all. Let me promise you. The flip side of that, I will say, is looking at thousands of applications the past few years, I generally see applicants plateau on the third or fourth try. And at that point, retaking it more than that might just be causing more pain or take away from other parts of your application, and it may not be an effective use of time. So just think about that.
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of that on GMAT Club as well. Third or fourth attempt, and if I remember well, GMSC also came up with a research that sort of confirms what you said right now. Thank you for sharing that as well. So I wanted to get a little bit of, like your thoughts on how Ross is doing compared to, other schools. So for example, if someone wants to apply to schools, is trying to look at different schools, and that to be honest, the first place that the person would go to is the rankings, right? And that sort of happens to be the first place that they go to. So now, if you had to differentiate of how Ross is different from peer schools, so what do you think makes Ross a lot different? And if you ask me that question, I would probably try to talk a little bit about the MAP program. But if I had to ask you, what would you say makes Ross different?
Yeah, you were right. So I give you credit. I mean, the first thing we always talk about, and I talked a little bit about it before, but I could give some more examples, is this, If you're somebody who likes to learn by doing and be out in the field doing things, and is worried about more traditional, what might be considered boring lecture and case study style, I mean, this is the place for you. We celebrated last year the 25th anniversary of our MAT projects. I won't go too detailed into it because there are other opportunities to learn, and many of you know about it. But for the last 7 weeks of your first year as a student, you're a consultant to a top company around the world. Google, Amazon, Facebook, dozens of all the top employers are sponsoring MAT projects. For Indian applicants in particular, it's an incredible way to get exposure with a US company on your resume before internships even begin. I think that's an ultimate differentiator, and it's something you'll use in recruiting, and an incredible experience. I mean, over 90% of the projects present to a C-suite executive. That's also not the only action-based learning. I mean, the most popular class at Ross is probably the CEO's class. We have a different CEO come in every week to class, and a group of students actually presents themselves as the board of the company and presents to the CEO, takes questions from different students, their classmates who are role-playing, say, government regulators or the board of directors, and then the CEO comes down to the front of the room after a break and gives real-time feedback. If you're talking of Fortune 500 CEOs, in a closed-door sense, unplugged, that's a different way to learn leadership. So those are the points of emphasis. There's many more ways to learn about that, but to me, that would be the biggest thing to pay attention to. The second, and a big reason I think my wife and I were so excited about Ross when we were looking at business schools, is we often say this idea of go blue, go anywhere. We're not a regionally based school. I'd argue, frankly, compared to the other top 10 schools, we're the best geographically agnostic option. We have the most alumni in the world of any university. We have alums working in over 90 countries, and 65% of our class goes to the East Coast, the West Coast, or Chicago. So I think some people are worried, oh, Ann Arbor's a small town, you're a little removed from the company I want to be in. It couldn't be the more opposite, because our alumni network is so strong everywhere, and having that flexibility to recruit anywhere in the US and that the Michigan brand name will be strong is a big differentiator. I think, some schools are really strong in the Northeast or really strong in the South. Michigan is a place that has a network everywhere, so that's something I'd consider. The last thing I'll point out is, we talk a lot about community here. It's a buzzword. I know other schools brag about their culture. We all have our own distinct culture. Community is a really, really big thing here. We have 400 students who come from 45 countries. 95% of our students come from outside of Michigan, and they all live within about a 10-minute walk of Ross. So it's a very, very immersive community that A, leads to a better alumni network, and B, there's a lot of support from second-year students in the recruiting process. I probably don't have enough time to detail all of it, but this idea of a second-year coach being a peer support throughout the recruiting process and walking you through that, I think it's a lot different than the culture, say, for consulting recruiting, where it's really pressurized and you're kind of on your own, and it's a little stressful at other schools. If you talk to Ross students about their recruiting experience, it couldn't be more different than that. So that's really important to me, and I think stands out.
Thank you for that, Michael. Really helpful. So, because you sort of mentioned recruiting, I wanted to touch on, opportunities for international students, right? So, yeah. And currently, I think there's a little bit of anxiety on how opportunities will be next year of the class of 2020. So what has been your experience of internships and full-time recruitment at Ross this year? What kind of industries do you think are really hiring international students and opportunities for H-1Bs? So what kind of careers do you think are the best for international prospective applicants?
Yeah, I completely relate and understand how touchy this is for international students. It's always been a big investment for an MBA program, and now more than ever, I appreciate the anxiety, and it's something our community talks about on a daily or weekly basis, and we're really sensitive to and care about. I think historically, and this hasn't changed, H-1B visas are the most prevalent in consulting, tech, and finance banking type roles. Those three industries seem to be the most consistent and strongest recruiting options, where all the big names are sponsoring, all the big players are here on campus, and very little has changed. I do think some of the other industries are a little trickier, to be quite honest. But amongst those industries, and the good news is frankly, 38% of our class went into consulting, and about 21 or 22% went into tech. So, things that Ross is really strong in are doing really well for international students. I will tell you, I asked our Indian students, other international students all year how they were feeling about this, and the energy was really good about it. Yeah, there were some troublesome moments or concerns naturally, but the vast majority of folks shared that things haven't changed. Actually, Amazon was one of the companies that I think across the MBA industry, they've stopped recruiting at some other schools or international interviews at other schools. They still were at Ross, and they actually still hired the most Ross MBAs out of any company or any other school in the country. So that was a really good data point for us that things are going well. And I think a big part of it is the exposure to U.S. firms and experience through MAP is something that keeps recruiters coming back to Ross for international students, because they know the value of that experience and how strong our students are because of that experience. So that really stands out for me. The last thing I'd mention that I think is a little bit different or interesting, the Ross schedule really allows international students every opportunity to finish their class schedule early. So if you were to have a full-time offer in the, say the first half of your second year, which most of our students do, you could actually apply for the H-1B visa during the April and May lottery early, say, and if for some reason you didn't get it, you actually would have a second shot at it the following year. And so Career Services and our program office have been really diligent with students working on that schedule to sort of push them towards that and work with their schedules to give them that opportunity. And I think that's a really helpful thing to have in your back pocket, to know you have two shots at it.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I think the anxiety is real, but also I think sort of some of the proposed changes are actually MBA student friendly. But yeah, good to know that Ross is doing a lot of stuff to alleviate some of that. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
So we're going to the final leg of this interview, and I just wanted to ask a few more questions about applications again, because that's sort of why most of our audience is here. So if you had to research on Ross, and if you had to really show that you're interested in Ross, what would you say are the best ways of doing that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is taking advantage of our student community. Over half the class volunteers to be a student ambassador and post their information on our website. You can filter by where they're from, the industry they're in. They have a full biography of what they did beforehand. You can really meet current students who have very similar backgrounds to you. Over half our class does that, and take advantage of that. I sometimes hear from candidates who are unsure how much they should do that or uncomfortable, and I always remind them somebody answered our current students' questions 2 years ago or a year ago. So I think that's such a valuable way. You don't have to necessarily fly around the country or world to, visit Ross to feel what the culture's like or to learn about recruiting in your industry. Really take advantage of that. On a similar note, reaching out to our clubs and, the clubs or the venture funds that you might be interested in. They all have websites with their current student leadership, and they would be happy to talk to you about their experience. So I think that's a really big thing. And then naturally, of course, talking to alums in your community or locally at your company. If there are Michigan Ross alums there, or even LinkedIning with some of them at a target company and reaching out to them with your if you've given some thought to your questions, I think that could be a great way to show us you really understand our culture and how Ross can help you get to your goals.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I'm not totally sure if this was last year or the year before, but so I sort of saw a lot of panic-stricken applicants. They're like, "Oh, I did not really talk to raw students, and the application portal is asking me to write the names of students I reached out to."
Yeah.
So I think it's just good to start early, especially. When I was researching on Ross, I found it the most useful to start reaching out in April, because that's sort of the time that students have still not started off their internship.
Yeah.
Or after July when they're done, wouldn't you say?
Oh, I just said I agree with that. I think that's smart.
Yeah. All right, so we're moving on to the last bit of our session, the Ross team exercise. Yeah, it's a very interesting, but also again anxiety-causing feature of the entire application process. So last year, the team exercise in India was in December, and I remember a lot of round one applicants who were waitlisted were asked to participate. So how is that going to happen this year? You mentioned before this interview that there are some changes, so we all would love to know what's going on.
Yeah, so this is a bit of breaking news. I'm excited to share a couple of things. First of all, the team exercise is going to change a little bit. It's going to be similar, but we're going to add sort of a part 2 to it and make it's a little bit longer and maybe a little bit more improv, and ask you to think a little bit more during the exercise within your group a little more strategically. So keep an eye out for Sujin's blog to learn more about how that's going to work and what we're looking for. But I'm excited for sort of the 2.0 of that. The second part here, which is also breaking news, is for the first time ever, we've always actually done the team exercise, usually in round 2 in late January or early February. This year, the University of Michigan is celebrating its bicentennial. We're 200 years old. It's an incredible feat. We're one of the oldest universities in the world. And we're excited to celebrate. The only celebration outside of Michigan is happening in India because of how strong and active the alumni network is. So the Dean of Ross will be coming. I will be attending. Deans from other parts of the university will be there. But because of all this, I thought when better to host a team exercise and hopefully have even more alumni participating than usual, because it's going to be held over the same weekend. So it's really kind of combining a great moment for the university with also inviting prospective students to learn more about us. So for that reason, we're going to hold the team exercise in late November. So it definitely is a change. It's as always, and if you've done your homework, you know this, the team exercise has always been optional. We've admitted many great students from round 1 from international locations who never did the team exercise. But this year, if you want to participate and that's something you feel really strongly about in your application, I would probably recommend applying in round 1 because that'll be your best opportunity to do the team exercise. I believe we're going to do the team exercise in Asia somewhere in round 2. Somewhere probably in either Japan or China. So there'll be sort of another opportunity, but it would involve more travel. So yeah, I can't wait to be there in November. It should be a very, very exciting time. And I definitely encourage applicants to take part in the team exercise if they're invited. I think it's a great way to show us you're a fit for the community, but also learn more about the school.
Awesome. I think this is a great piece of information because a lot of the students from last year had this to say, oh, okay, so I don't want to really screw up in my team exercise, so I will make sure that I apply in round 1.
Yeah. Well, if that's how you're approaching it, maybe apply in round 2. But no, jokes aside, it's not required to get in, but I hope that, 95% of the time, the team exercise helps applicants as opposed to hurting. we're really looking for indications that you work well within a team, and you have great interpersonal qualities, as opposed to reasons not to admit you. So I think I highly recommend candidates to take advantage of it if they can.
Yeah, yeah. I know. I personally know quite a few people who went to Delhi last year for the team exercise, and
Okay.
more than a stressful experience, I think they came out having fun. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's one of my favorite events, and I always have current students tell me that's how I understood what it was like to be a Ross student, or that's when I knew that I was a fit. And so I think it's really a great way to get a sense for that and see what it would be like in a Ross setting.
Awesome. So we are literally at the close of this talk. I just wanted to end with one last question.
Yeah.
So if you had to give one piece of advice to Indian students who applying to Raw frame of mind, so numbers are against me. GMAT score average is slightly higher. My leadership stories are stereotypical. How can I differentiate myself without trying too hard? What would your advice be?
Yeah, it's a hard question because it's probably different for each person, right? Based on your stories and what makes you unique. But I keep going back to this idea of pushing yourself to be authentic and not overthinking this process. I know that sounds crazy because it's one of the most competitive things you'll ever do, and it's so much of a time commitment. And I'm not advising you don't put effort in, right? It's different than that, but I think applicants sometimes forget, why they first wanted to go to business school, or why, they've been so successful in their careers, because they think it's not what we want to hear, or we don't value it. You know, if you focus on what makes you unique, because everybody's unique, you come across as somebody who's memorable and stands out to us. And don't lose that in this process. Everybody has a unique story, and you want to share that. And particularly throughout the essays and the interview, is your time to shine. And don't become too scripted, or give us an answer that somebody thought Ross wanted to hear when it's not how you truly feel.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for that. I do believe that a lot of applicants, especially Indian applicants, are a little bit more relieved after this interview. Thank you
Good.
so
That's what
much
it's
for your
about.
time, Michael. This was lovely. Uh, all the best for the bicentennial celebrations, and I hope you have a great time in India.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I'll just leave you all a couple of FYIs. Leading up to the team exercise, we'll also be holding info sessions in India that week. So in mid-November, we'll be in Delhi, Bangalore, and Mumbai. I hope to see many applicants. Even if you've already applied, some of the information from me probably seems old, but it's a good opportunity for me to connect with you, but more importantly, connect with our alums. We'll have alums at those events, so I encourage people to come out. And if you want some more information before you apply, we'll have an India-specific webinar on September 26th with some of our current India students to talk about their experience at Ross. And there's a number of Ross career-specific webinars all throughout October, so definitely keep an eye out on those.
Awesome. I remember, I think there was an MAP webinar. I think it was scheduled on July. I think it got pushed to October. So I think there are a bunch of them then.
Yes, we're looking forward to that. And then there's consulting and marketing and healthcare and finance, and all the different sort of go-to recruiting options at Ross. We'll have a specific webinar in October and November.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Michael. I hope to see you soon. And yeah, we will touch base. Thank you so much.
All right, I really enjoyed it. Good luck to everybody, and I hope to meet many of you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.